The sharp slap cut through the hush of the cabin, freezing everyone in place. Conversations halted mid-sentence, eyes snapped toward seat 1A, and an eerie silence filled the air. The flight attendant's hand remained suspended in the space where it had landed, her face twisted with anger. She thought she was teaching a man a lesson. What she didn't realize was that the man she had just struck owned the entire airline. And within moments, her world was about to shatter. Before we dive into the full story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The first-class cabin was nearly full, a blend of quiet conversations, the rustling of newspapers, and the soft clinking of crystal glasses. Marcus Hayes sat in seat 1A, leaning back comfortably as he flipped through a magazine. He wasn't trying to draw attention to himself. Unlike some of the other high-profile travelers discussing their latest deals in loud, confident voices or making endless special requests, he was a frequent flyer and preferred to keep things simple. His black button-down shirt was neatly pressed, the sleeves casually rolled just enough to reveal a high-end timepiece on his wrist. It wasn't ostentatious, but anyone with an eye for luxury would recognize it as something that only a select few could afford. His dark trousers fit perfectly, his polished shoes resting lightly on the floor. Everything about him radiated a quiet ease. Yet something about him didn't sit right with Evelyn Carter, the senior flight attendant assigned to first class that evening. Evelyn had been in the airline industry for over 10 years. She knew first-class passengers, how they carried themselves, how they spoke, how they expected to be treated. They were confident, demanding, sometimes even entitled. But one thing was always clear. They made sure everyone knew they belonged in first class. Marcus, however, was too quiet, too calm, too unfazed. He wasn't like the usual businessmen who occupied these seats. He wasn't constantly on the phone, wasn't buried in emails, and he certainly wasn't murmuring in a low, arrogant voice about stocks or real estate deals. He just sat there, flipping through his magazine as if he could be anywhere in the world and it wouldn't matter. That alone made Evelyn suspicious. She passed by his seat once, then a second time. Her curiosity only deepened. Finally, she stopped beside him, her expression neutral but her tone carrying an edge of authority. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Marcus looked up slowly, his dark brown eyes meeting hers without hesitation. There was no confusion in his face, no irritation, just a calm, quiet understanding. "Yes." His voice was steady as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass. Without a word, he handed it to her. Evelyn took it, scanning it quickly. Seat 1A, first class, verified. Her lips pressed together. His name, Marcus Hayes, matched the passenger manifest. The ticket was fully paid for. No upgrades, no seating errors. Everything checked out, and yet, something inside her still wouldn't let it go. She forced a polite smile and handed the ticket back. "All right, thank you, sir," she said stiffly, before turning away. Marcus didn't react. He simply took his boarding pass, slid it back into his pocket, and turned another page in his magazine, completely unbothered by the brief exchange. Evelyn, however, wasn't finished. She moved to the front of the cabin, crossing her arms as she watched him from the corner of her eye. Something still felt off. She turned toward Sophie Lane, another flight attendant who was busy preparing drinks in the galley. "Something's not right," Evelyn murmured. Sophie glanced over, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Evelyn lowered her voice. "Passenger in 1A. Something's off about him. He doesn't act like he belongs here." Sophie frowned. "What? You checked his ticket, didn't you?" "I did. It's valid." But Evelyn hesitated, tightening her jaw. "I just have a feeling." Sophie let out a quiet sigh. "Evelyn, come on, you know how this sounds." But Evelyn wasn't listening. She grabbed the passenger manifest, running her finger down the list of first-class travelers again. Marcus Hayes. His name was right there. No last-minute upgrades, no seating mistakes. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. And yet, she still didn't believe it. "I'm going to find out," she muttered under her breath, narrowing her eyes. She turned on her heel, walking briskly back toward seat 1A, already preparing her next move. Evelyn took a slow, measured breath as she approached him again. She had done this job long enough to trust her instincts, and something about Marcus wasn't adding up. Sure, his ticket was valid. But people found ways to game the system all the time. Maybe he had gotten the ticket from someone else. Maybe there had been a clerical error. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't supposed to be in first class at all. She stopped beside him, resting one hand on the headrest of the empty seat in front of him. Her voice was still polite, but firmer now. "Sir, I just need to confirm, are you traveling alone?" Marcus lowered his magazine again, his gaze lingering on her this time. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't frustration. It was curiosity. "Yes, I am." Evelyn forced a smile, tight and strained. "And this ticket, it wasn't upgraded, was it?" Marcus remained still for a moment, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the magazine. Then, with the same steady calm as before, he replied, "No, it wasn't upgraded. I purchased it." His voice was smooth, steady, completely uninterested in whatever game she was playing. But Evelyn Carter wasn't done. She placed both hands on her hips, tilting her head slightly. "Do you mind showing me your ID?" A few heads in the first-class cabin turned slightly, subtle glances cast toward seat 1A as passengers began noticing the exchange. Marcus Hayes exhaled quietly. With slow, deliberate movements, he closed his magazine, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his wallet. Without a word, he slid out his identification and handed it over. Evelyn took it, her eyes scanning the details. His name matched the ticket. His photo was on the ID. Everything was in order. And yet, she didn't move. She stood there a second too long, gripping the ID, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. There had to be something wrong. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice just as calm as before, but now there was a sharp edge to it. "Is there a problem, miss?" Something about the way he said it made Evelyn's chest tighten. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't defensive, but there was a firmness in his tone, a warning. She swallowed, glancing at the ID one last time before finally handing it back. "No problem," she said, her voice clipped. "Enjoy your flight." Marcus took his ID, slid it back into his wallet, and picked up his magazine once again, resuming his reading as if nothing had happened. Evelyn, however, wasn't done. She turned sharply on her heel, walking briskly toward the front of the plane, her mind racing. Something wasn't right. She just had to prove it. Back in the galley, Evelyn's breath came a little faster than before. She wasn't sure why this was bothering her so much, but she couldn't let it go. Everything had checked out, his ticket, his ID, his seat assignment. There was no logical reason to doubt him. But that feeling in her gut? It wouldn't go away. Sophie Lane, the younger flight attendant, noticed her pacing. "Evelyn, you're still obsessing over 1A?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Evelyn huffed, folding her arms. "You didn't see the way he looked at me, like he knows something I don't." Sophie gave her a look. "Or maybe he looked at you like that because you just asked him for his ID, after you already saw his ticket." Evelyn shot her a glare but didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed the in-flight phone and pressed a button, connecting to ground control. A static click, then a voice on the other end. "Flight operations, go ahead." Evelyn kept her voice steady. "This is Evelyn Carter, lead cabin crew for Flight 718. I need a ticket verification for a first-class passenger, Marcus Hayes, seat 1A. A pause. Then the sound of typing. "Hold one moment." The wait felt longer than it should have. Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. Finally the voice returned. "Ticket was purchased under the name Marcus Hayes, paid in full, no upgrades, no irregularities." Evelyn's jaw clenched. "And there's nothing unusual? No last-minute changes? No special requests?" More typing. "Nope, everything looks standard." Evelyn exhaled sharply, rubbing her forehead. "All right, thanks." She hung up the phone. Sophie smirked. "Well, was your mystery man secretly a stowaway?" Evelyn ignored the sarcasm, shaking her head. "No, but I still don't trust it." Sophie rolled her eyes. "Evelyn, you're looking for a problem that doesn't exist? Just leave it alone." But Evelyn wasn't convinced. Passengers didn't make her feel this uneasy for no reason. She pulled out her work tablet, opening the passenger manifest again. Scrolling down, she stopped at Marcus Hayes' name. Everything was correct, and yet, she still felt like something was missing. She thought for a moment. Then she decided, if she couldn't find proof now, she'd watch him throughout the flight. If something was off, she'd catch it. And if he didn't belong here, she'd make sure he didn't stay. Evelyn forced herself to stay busy as the rest of the passengers settled in, but her mind never left seat 1A. Every time she walked past, she stole a glance at Marcus. Searching for something? anything that confirmed her suspicion, but he remained calm, flipping through his magazine, occasionally checking his phone, like any normal passenger. And yet, something about him still felt wrong. She watched as another flight attendant, Daniel Reyes, walked through first class offering drinks. When he reached Marcus, his tone was warm. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" Marcus looked up, offering a polite but firm smile. "Just water, please." Daniel nodded, poured the drink, and handed it to him. Marcus took it with a quiet, "Thank you." No arrogance, no demands, nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, Evelyn felt her irritation grow. She had seen this too many times before. Passengers trying to blend in where they didn't belong. Some were scammers. Some were last-minute seat grabbers who switched after boarding. Some were lucky upgrades who acted like they paid full price. She wasn't about to let someone pull that on her watch. As Daniel walked back toward the galley, Evelyn turned to him. Her voice was lower now. "Hey, what do you think about 1A? Daniel frowned. "The guy who just asked for water?" "Yeah, what about him?" Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Don't you think he seems out of place?" Daniel blinked. "What? No, he seems fine. Quiet, polite, honestly better than half the people up here." Evelyn pressed her lips together. "I don't know, I just have a feeling." Daniel chuckled. "A feeling? Evelyn, you've got to stop doing this." She ignored him, stealing another glance toward first class. Her stomach twisted as Marcus Hayes pulled out his phone and typed something. His expression never changed, but she swore there was something calculated about him. She tapped her nails against the counter. She was going to figure this out. And if he didn't belong in first class, she'd make sure this was his last time sitting there. Evelyn could feel the pulse in her ears as she moved through the first-class cabin, forcing herself to focus on the other passengers. She refilled drinks, adjusted overhead bins, smiled at the entitled businessman who barely acknowledged her. And yet, every few minutes, her eyes drifted back to seat 1A. Marcus hadn't caused a scene. He hadn't raised his voice. But something about him made her uneasy. It wasn't just his calmness. It was the fact that he seemed too comfortable, like he had nothing to prove. But men like him, they always had something to prove. She watched as he casually scrolled through his phone, then set it down on the tray table. His fingers drummed lightly against the armrest, a slow, measured rhythm. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't impatient. He was just waiting. Evelyn turned sharply and headed toward the galley, where Sophie Lane was finishing up paperwork. She grabbed a glass, filling it with ice water, but her mind wasn't on the task. Sophie sighed without looking up. "You're still obsessing over 1A, aren't you?" Evelyn exhaled, frustrated. "It's not obsessing, Sophie. Something isn't right. He's too quiet, too composed." Sophie let out a laugh. "Oh no, a polite, well-mannered man in first class. How suspicious." Evelyn shot her a look. "I'm serious." Sophie leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "Evelyn, you're picking a fight where there isn't one. You checked his ticket. You checked his ID. You even called ground control. What else do you need? A signed letter from the airline CEO?" Evelyn stiffened. For a split second, something flickered across her expression, but she quickly masked it. Sophie didn't notice. Evelyn, however, felt her own mind racing. She glanced back toward first class, just in time to see Marcus take a slow sip of his water before setting the glass neatly back on the tray. The movement was too controlled. She tightened her grip on the counter. Something was off. She turned back to Sophie. "I'm just saying, I've been doing this job a long time, and my gut is never wrong." Sophie groaned, rubbing her temples. "Your gut is always wrong." Evelyn ignored her, already forming a plan. If ground control wasn't going to back her up, and if Sophie wanted to brush it off, then fine. She'd handle it herself. Evelyn smoothed out her uniform, took a breath, and marched back toward first class. She slowed her pace when she reached Marcus's seat, resting one hand on the top of an empty chair across the aisle. He didn't look up. She hated that. Passengers in first class were always aware of the flight attendants. They expected attention. They demanded it. They acted like they owned the plane. But Marcus? He sat there like he didn't have to prove himself to anyone. Evelyn cleared her throat. "Excuse me, Mr. Hayes." Slowly, Marcus looked up. His face was unreadable. His expression gave away nothing. Evelyn forced a smile. "I just need to confirm one more thing with you." A few passengers shifted in their seats, glancing over. Marcus didn't move. His eyes stayed on hers. Patient. Waiting. She placed both hands on the seat in front of him, leaning in slightly. "Would you mind telling me what you do for a living?" The question lingered in the air, unexpected and deliberate. For the first time since boarding, Marcus's expression shifted. Not in surprise, not in anger, but in amusement, like he had been expecting this moment. A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Why?" His voice was calm. Evelyn hesitated, just for half a second, but quickly recovered. "I'm just curious." Marcus tilted his head slightly. Curious or suspicious? Evelyn's stomach tightened. He knew. He knew. But instead of calling her out, instead of making a scene, he simply reached for his glass, took another sip of water, and set it back down with that same deliberate ease. Then, with a small shrug, he answered, "I own an airline." Silence. Evelyn's lips parted slightly. Her mind raced. A few passengers nearby turned their heads. She forced out a small, confused laugh. "You own an airline?" Marcus nodded. His smile never faded. "That's what I said." She stared at him, waiting for him to elaborate, but he didn't. He let the words sit there, heavy and untouched. Evelyn's breath hitched. There was no way, no possible way. And yet, something in his tone, the confidence, the certainty, the way he looked at her, like he was waiting for her to figure it out, made her stomach twist. A lump formed in Evelyn's throat. She swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. Who was this man? Her mind raced, but she forced herself to stay composed. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, entitled businessmen, celebrities who thought the world revolved around them, first-class elites who believed their money gave them control over the crew. She knew how to handle them. But Marcus Hayes? He wasn't demanding. He wasn't throwing his wealth in her face. He wasn't even arguing. He had simply stated something so outrageous, so unbelievable, that for a brief moment, more. She wasn't sure if he was playing a game. Evelyn let out a short, stiff laugh. "You own an airline?" She crossed her arms, shifting her weight slightly. "Which one?" Marcus's smile didn't fade. Calmly, he picked up his water, took another slow sip, and set the glass back down before meeting her gaze. "You'll find out soon enough." Evelyn's stomach twisted. He wasn't joking. She didn't know why, but she believed him. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was used to control. She was used to passengers who either obeyed her authority or pushed back with visible irritation. But Marcus? He was playing at a different level. One she couldn't quite figure out. The air between them felt heavier, like a shift had just occurred, and she was the only one who hadn't realized it yet. She straightened her uniform and cleared her throat. "All right, sir. If there's anything else you need, let me know." Marcus gave her a small nod, like he was dismissing her. And for some reason, that infuriated her. Evelyn turned sharply, walking quickly toward the galley, her heart pounding. What the hell was going on? She pulled back the curtain separating first class and the galley, nearly running into Sophie. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Wow, you look like you've seen a ghost." Evelyn let out a breath, gripping the edge of the counter. "He says he owns an airline." Sophie blinked. "Who?" Evelyn glared. 1A, Sophie snorted. "Oh, come on." Evelyn shook her head. "I'm serious. He looked me dead in the eye and said, 'I own an airline.'" Sophie gave her a skeptical look. "And you believed him?" Evelyn hesitated. She didn't want to admit it. But yes. Yes, she did. Sophie sighed, setting down the paperwork she'd been reviewing. "Evelyn, you've been weird about this guy since the moment he sat down. What exactly do you think is happening here? That some billionaire secretly booked a flight on his own airline just to sit in first class like a regular person?" Evelyn opened her mouth, then closed it, because when Sophie said it out loud, it did sound ridiculous. But something was off. She didn't know what, but she was going to find out. She grabbed her work tablet, scrolling through the passenger list for the third time. Marcus Hayes, ticket confirmed. No flagged security concerns, no special notes. But his name... Something about it nagged at her. Her fingers hesitated over the screen. Then, almost on instinct, she typed his name into the airline's internal database, searching for additional notes. The screen loaded. Access restricted. Her pulse spiked. She tried again. Same result. Sophie peeked over her shoulder. "What are you doing?" Evelyn's mouth felt dry. "His profile is locked." Sophie frowned. "So?" Evelyn slowly turned to her. "That only happens when someone is VIP." Sophie's smirk faded. "What?" Evelyn swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the tablet a little tighter. She had only seen this a handful of times before. Top executives, high-profile government officials, people whose travel information was kept private. Marcus Hayes wasn't just a regular passenger, and if what he had said was true, she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Sophie reached for the tablet, but Evelyn pulled it back. Her mind spun. She had questioned him, pressed him, pushed too far. And now, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. Whatever came next, it wasn't going to end well for her. Evelyn's breathing felt shallow as she stared at the screen. Access restricted. The words flashed in her mind like a warning sign, pounding at her chest, telling her she had stepped into something far bigger than she had realized. VIP passengers weren't just anyone. They were people the airline protected, people whose information was locked down because of their wealth, power, or status. Evelyn had worked first class for years. She had served politicians, movie stars, Fortune 500 executives, even a few minor royals, and she knew the golden rule. You never, ever question the wrong person. And yet, that's exactly what she had done. Sophie's voice pulled her back to the present. Evelyn, what does that mean? Evelyn turned to her, her voice lower now. It means he's not just some random guy. Sophie let out a breath. Okay, but important how? Evelyn hesitated. Then finally she said it out loud. He said he owns an airline. Sophie's eyes widened slightly before she scoffed. That's impossible. If he did, we'd know who he was. Evelyn shook her head. No, we wouldn't. Sophie frowned. What do you mean? Evelyn exhaled slowly. Think about it. The people at the very top, the ones who actually run things, they don't need their names out there. They don't flaunt it. They don't make a show of who they are. They let everyone else do that for them. Sophie didn't answer, because deep down, she knew Evelyn was right. And that was the scariest part of all. Sophie rubbed her temples. All right, let's say, just for a second, that he's telling the truth. That doesn't mean it's our airline, right? Evelyn's fingers tightened around the tablet. She hadn't thought about that. There were dozens of major airlines in the world, each with powerful owners who rarely, if ever, appeared in public. But if Marcus Hayes was a name protected in their own system, that changed everything. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Sophie exhaled sharply. Okay, fine, so maybe he's someone big. What do we do? Evelyn didn't answer, because no matter how she looked at it, she had already crossed a line. She turned back toward first class, peeking through the curtain. Marcus was still sitting there, completely relaxed. He had finished his water. His tray table was cleared. Now, he rested with one arm draped over the seat, his gaze focused on the window, as if he had all the time in the world. No tension, no frustration, just patience. Like he was waiting. Evelyn's fingers curled into a fist. Waiting for what? She turned back to Sophie. I need to talk to the captain. Sophie's head snapped up. What? Evelyn, no, that'll make this 1,000 times worse. Evelyn's jaw clenched. Worse than what? What if we have someone on board who could shut this whole airline down? Sophie's face paled slightly. You don't know that. Evelyn swallowed hard. I don't, but I know that if he's really who he says he is. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Sophie exhaled, rubbing her hands over her face. Okay, but don't make a scene. Just be careful. Evelyn nodded, straightened her uniform, and stepped out of the galley. She moved quickly, but with purpose, making her way toward the front of the plane. She could feel her pulse in her throat, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to handle this the right way. Reaching the cockpit door, she knocked lightly. A few seconds later, Captain Harrington cracked it open, his brow furrowed. Something wrong? Evelyn hesitated for only a second before speaking. I need to talk to you. It's about a passenger. The captain's expression turned serious. What's the issue? Evelyn took a breath. I think we have someone important on board, and I might have just made a very, very big mistake. Captain Harrington didn't speak right away. He stepped back, opening the door wider. Come inside. Evelyn stepped through. As the door clicked shut behind her, a realization hit. This wasn't just about Marcus Hayes. This was about her career. And if she wasn't careful, she wasn't going to have one by the time this flight landed. The cockpit was dimly lit, glowing screens reflecting off the polished metal panels. Captain Harrington stood near the control panel, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Beside him, First Officer Grant glanced up from his tablet, sensing the tension immediately. Evelyn shifted on her feet, her palms slightly damp. This was not a conversation she wanted to have. Harrington leaned against the back wall, nodding for her to speak. "All right, what's going on?" Evelyn took another breath. "I have reason to believe we have a VIP passenger on board. Someone extremely high up, and I may have questioned him." The captain's brows pulled together. "Questioned how?" Evelyn hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I didn't think he belonged in first class." The silence stretched between them, tightening around her like a noose. First Officer Grant sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Evelyn." Harrington's jaw clenched slightly. "You're telling me you singled out a first-class passenger and basically accused him of sneaking in?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "I asked for his ticket, his ID. I even called ground control for verification. Everything checked out, but—" The captain's expression hardened. "And now?" Evelyn exhaled. "I ran his name through the system. His profile is locked. I've only seen that happen for high-level executives or government officials." Harrington's gaze flickered. Now she had his full attention. VIP status wasn't a joke. Airlines protected their most important passengers, because the wrong treatment could mean lawsuits, media scandals, or worse, a powerful person pulling their business entirely. Grant shifted in his seat, suddenly more alert. "Who is it?" Evelyn hesitated. Then, finally, she said it. "Marcus Hayes." Harrington and Grant exchanged a glance. Neither name recognition nor immediate panic crossed their faces, but there was a shift in the air. Grant frowned. "I don't know that name." Evelyn's voice was tight. "He told me he owns an airline." Harrington's face barely twitched, but the sharp inhale through his nose gave him away. Evelyn's stomach dropped. He knew something. Grant frowned deeper, confused. "That doesn't make sense. We would know if—" Harrington cut him off. "What exactly did he say?" Evelyn clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remember every detail. "I asked him what he did for a living. He looked at me like he had been waiting for the question. Then he said—" She swallowed. "I own an airline." Harrington remained quiet for a moment. Then, finally, he muttered under his breath, "Son of a—" He reached for his tablet. Captain Harrington's fingers moved quickly over the tablet, typing something into a secure airline database. Evelyn's hands felt cold. She had never seen him react like this. First Officer Grant, still confused, leaned over his shoulder. "What are you looking for?" Harrington didn't answer right away. The screen flickered. Then he let out a slow breath. He turned the tablet so they could both see. Evelyn's stomach plummeted. There, in bold letters, was the name Marcus Hayes, chairman and majority stakeholder, Horizon Elite Airlines. Owner of the very airline they were flying for. The blood drained from Evelyn's face. She had just humiliated the man who signed her paycheck. Grant let out a quiet whistle. "Well, that's a problem." Evelyn felt her heartbeat in her ears. "This is a joke, right? This can't be real." Harrington gave her a hard look. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Evelyn's stomach twisted painfully. Her entire body went cold. She had spent the last hour interrogating, doubting, and dismissing the man who literally owned the airline. Her breathing felt shallow. "What do I do?" Harrington exhaled sharply, setting the tablet down. "You fix it, now." Evelyn's hands were slightly shaking. "How? What am I supposed to say? Sorry for assuming you don't belong in your own airline?" Grant gave her a sideways glance. "That'd be a good start." Evelyn closed her eyes for a second, with Stallup, then nodded quickly. "Okay, I'll go to him. I'll apologize." Harrington's voice stopped her before she could turn. "No, not just an apology." She hesitated. "What do you mean?" The captain's voice was level, but there was an edge of finality in it. "You're gonna fix this? In front of the entire first-class cabin?" Evelyn's stomach dropped further. She had humiliated Marcus Hayes in public. Now she had to correct it in public. She opened her mouth to protest, but one look at Harrington's face told her there was no room for negotiation. She had messed up. And now, she was about to pay the price. Evelyn felt like the walls of the cockpit were closing in. Her breath was shallow, her stomach tight. The reality of what she had done, who she had done it to, was fully sinking in. She had made mistakes before, plenty of times in her career. But never like this. Never with someone who had the power to erase her career with a single phone call. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to pull it together. Fix it. In front of everyone. That was the captain's order. That was the only way to stop this from spiraling into something worse. Her legs felt heavier than they ever had as she stepped out of the cockpit. The cabin stretched before her, like a runway she wasn't sure she could walk down. The moment she emerged, Sophie Lane shot her a questioning look. "Well?" Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't have time. Her heart pounded as she smoothed out her uniform, straightened her shoulders, and forced her legs to move. The walk to 1A felt like it lasted forever. She could feel passengers watching her. They sensed a shift in energy, even if they didn't quite understand why yet. But Marcus? He hadn't moved. He sat there, still as ever, one arm resting lightly on the armrest, his expression unreadable, waiting. Evelyn reached his seat. She swallowed hard before she spoke. "Mr. Hayes." The moment his name left her lips, a few first-class passengers turned their heads slightly. Some had overheard bits and pieces of their earlier conversation, but now, they were paying attention. Marcus glanced up at her. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not surprise, not anger, just quiet expectation. Evelyn's throat felt tight, but she forced herself to push through. "I need to apologize." A ripple of silence settled over the first-class cabin. The nearby passengers who had been pretending not to listen were now fully tuned in. Marcus didn't react. He didn't nod. He didn't raise an eyebrow. He simply waited. Evelyn took a deep breath. "Earlier, I questioned your seat, your ticket, and your right to be here. I made an assumption, and that was a mistake." Still, Marcus didn't move. Evelyn's palms felt clammy, but she didn't look away. "You were nothing but polite, and I treated you unfairly. That is not how any passenger should be treated, especially not someone who built this airline." The nearby passengers stiffened. A murmur ran through the cabin. The realization hit them all at once. They all knew first class had VIPs. They knew some of the world's most powerful people sat in these seats. But none of them had realized they were sitting next to the man who owned the entire airline. Marcus exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. Not out of amusement, not out of anger, just something else. He looked up at Evelyn, then finally, he spoke. "And why did you assume I didn't belong?" Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. That was the question. The one she had been hoping he wouldn't ask. The passengers nearby turned their attention fully to her now. Some shifted in their seats. Others looked away, pretending not to be part of this moment. Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came out. Because deep down, she already knew the answer. But no words came out. Because Evelyn knew exactly why she had questioned him. It wasn't his clothes, it wasn't his behavior, it wasn't his attitude. It was because she had never expected to see a black man sitting alone in first class, carrying himself like he belonged there, without needing to prove it. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just about Marcus Hayes. This was about every person she had silently judged before. Every time she had seen a passenger and decided, without proof, without reason, that something wasn't right. Marcus was still staring at her, waiting for an answer. Evelyn swallowed hard. She could lie. She could make up some excuse, say it was about his demeanor, his calmness, his silence. But that wasn't the truth, and something told her. Marcus Hayes didn't tolerate lies. Her hands clenched at her sides as she forced herself to speak. "Because I made a bad judgment, and I have no excuse." Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. Not in forgiveness, not in approval, just in acknowledgement. A few of the nearby passengers let out slow breaths, as if they had been holding them the entire time. Evelyn's face burned with shame, but she held her posture. Marcus leaned back slightly, tapping a single finger on the armrest before speaking again. "You're right, you don't have an excuse." The words sank into her skin. He let the silence stretch between them. Then finally he sighed, shaking his head slightly. What happens now? Evelyn had no idea. She had done what the captain told her. She had apologized, owned her mistake, but now she was standing in front of the most powerful man in the airline industry, and she had no idea what came next. Marcus, however, did. He picked up his phone, typed a message, and sent it. Then he glanced back at Evelyn, his expression calm. "You should probably sit down." Her stomach twisted. Something was coming, and it was bigger than anything she had expected. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. Sit down? She didn't even have a seat. She was supposed to be working, supposed to be moving through the cabin, assisting passengers, making sure everything ran smoothly. But as she stood in front of Marcus Hayes, the man who owned the airline she worked for, she realized none of that mattered anymore. She had messed up, and now she was just waiting to see how bad the consequences would be. Marcus's fingers tapped lightly on his phone screen before he set it down on the tray table. His expression remained calm, unreadable. But something about him felt heavier now. The easy patience he had shown earlier, it was gone. A flight attendant questioning a first-class passenger was one thing, but questioning the owner of the airline? That was something else entirely. Evelyn felt the weight of the first-class passenger's eyes on her. No one was pretending to be uninterested anymore. They had caught the way Marcus had spoken to her, the way her voice had wavered in response. They knew something serious was happening. And then, as if to confirm it, the in-flight phone rang. The sound cut through the thick air like a warning bell. Evelyn stiffened, her breath catching. Nearby, Daniel Reyes stepped into the galley and grabbed the phone, holding it to his ear. "Yes, Captain?" Silence. Then, Daniel's face changed. His eyes flickered toward Evelyn. She knew. She knew before he even spoke. Daniel lowered the phone, turning to her with an unreadable expression. "The captain wants to see you." A decision has been made. A wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. The words felt like a final blow. Evelyn swallowed hard. Her mind screamed at her to keep herself together. But it was too late for composure. Too late to undo what had already been done. The passengers, who had been pretending to mind their own business, were now staring outright. Some whispered to one another. Others just watched the scene unfold. Marcus didn't look at her as she took a slow step back. He didn't need to. He had already played his move. Evelyn turned stiffly and started toward the front of the cabin. Her uniform felt too tight. The heat in her face burned as she pushed past the curtain into the galley. Daniel whispered, "Evelyn, what did you do?" She ignored him. She couldn't think about that right now. She reached the cockpit door and knocked once. The door opened immediately. Captain Harrington stood there. His face was unreadable. But the moment Evelyn stepped inside, the air in the cockpit felt suffocating, like a verdict had already been decided. She barely made it over the threshold before the captain spoke. "You're done for the day." Her throat went dry. She blinked. "Sir, no, His voice was sharp, cutting. "You've already done enough." Evelyn's lips parted, but nothing came out. Harrington exhaled, rubbing his temple before looking at her again. "Marcus Hayes has already contacted corporate. Your name is flagged for immediate disciplinary review." The room tilted. Evelyn gripped the back of the empty co-pilot's chair, trying to steady herself. Disciplinary review. Her head spun. This wasn't just a warning. This wasn't just a bad performance note on her record. This was something else entirely. This was the moment her career changed forever. This was a career-ending situation. Evelyn felt it in her bones, the weight of what had just been decided crushing down on her. First Officer Grant shifted awkwardly in his seat, clearly uncomfortable but not willing to speak up. She forced herself to find her voice, grasping at anything that might change the course of this conversation. "Sir, I didn't know who he was," she stammered. Captain Harrington let out a cold, humorless laugh. "And that's the problem," he said, his eyes never leaving her. Evelyn's nails dug into her palms as she tried again. "I was doing my job." The captain's expression hardened. "No, you were doing what you thought was your job, and you were wrong." The silence stretched, pressing in on her from all sides. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the reality of the moment sank in. She had made mistakes before. Argued with passengers who were out of line, held firm against travelers who tried to push their limits. But this? She had never been in a situation like this before. Harrington exhaled slowly, as if gathering his thoughts, then leaned back in his chair. "You'll disembark with security when we land." Evelyn's breath hitched. The world around her blurred for a moment. Security. The weight of that single word crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had seen it happen before. Crew members quietly escorted off flights, taken through back terminals, never to return. She knew what that meant. She wasn't just being reprimanded. She was being removed. Her career, over. She opened her mouth, desperate to defend herself, but no words came. Nothing she said would change what had already been decided. Harrington's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "This isn't just about you," he said, his tone sharp. Evelyn looked up, finding no sympathy in his gaze. You embarrassed this airline in front of the man who owns it. You questioned his right to sit in first class. You treated him like an imposter in his own business. Her stomach twisted violently. She wanted to argue, wanted to explain, but the truth was undeniable. The captain leaned forward, eyes locked on hers. You didn't just offend a passenger, he said. You disrespected the most powerful man in this industry. Evelyn stood frozen, unable to respond. She had made her choice. And now she was about to pay for it. The moment she stepped out of the cockpit, the air inside the cabin felt heavier, suffocating. She had always walked these aisles with confidence, authority, and control, believing she set the rules and maintained order. Now she was walking back through first class like a condemned woman. The passengers weren't pretending to be uninterested anymore. Their eyes followed her, curiosity giving way to realization. Some had overheard bits and pieces of what had happened. Others had already figured it out. And then there was Marcus Hayes, still seated in 1A. Completely composed, completely unbothered, like a man who had already won. Evelyn swallowed the bitter lump in her throat and forced her legs to move. She wanted to turn away, disappear into the galley, pretend none of this had happened. But she couldn't. She had to face him. Stopping beside his seat, she clenched her hands at her sides, trying to steady herself. Marcus finally looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He had been expecting this. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Evelyn could feel the weight of the moment, the judgment hanging between them, the complete shift in power. She cleared her throat, forcing her voice to remain steady. Mr. Hayes, But before she could finish, he held up a hand, stopping her instantly. No need, he said, his voice calm, smooth. I already know what you're going to say. Evelyn's stomach twisted. Did he know? Did he already know she had just been ordered to leave the plane with security? Did he realize that her entire future was balancing on the edge of a knife? Marcus exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You're not the first person to assume I don't belong somewhere, he said, and you won't be the last. His words hit her harder than she expected, because he wasn't just talking about this flight, he was talking about something much bigger. Her throat felt tight as she admitted, I was wrong. His gaze didn't soften. Yes, you were. Evelyn's face burned with shame. She had never felt this small. She thought back to how easily she had doubted him, how she had let her assumptions dictate her actions, how she had refused to accept the truth even when it was staring her in the face. How many other people had she done this to? Marcus leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once on the armrest before speaking again. Tell me something, Evelyn. Her breath caught in her throat. He knew her name. She hadn't introduced herself. He had never asked. And yet, he knew. That realization sent a fresh wave of unease through her. Marcus tilted his head slightly. If I had been wearing an expensive suit, flashing a watch, barking orders at you, would you have treated me the same way? Evelyn didn't answer immediately, because the truth was ugly, and he already knew it. She had seen plenty of first-class passengers who were loud, demanding, arrogant. She had never questioned them. But a quiet black man sitting alone, minding his own business? That had been enough. Her chest felt tight. I can't change what I did, she admitted, but I can own it. Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then finally, he gave a small nod. Not approval, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Without another word, he reached for his phone again, typed something, sent it, and that was it. Evelyn stood there, unsure of what had just happened. The tension in the air hadn't faded. The weight of her mistake hadn't lifted. And as Marcus casually set his phone down, still completely in control, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't just waiting for the consequences of her actions. She was waiting to see how much mercy the most powerful man in the airline industry was willing to give. Evelyn's breath felt shaky as she stepped back, unsure of what had just happened, what had just been decided. Marcus hadn't needed to yell at her, hadn't needed to raise his voice, hadn't needed to threaten her. He had handled it all with control, with quiet power, and somehow that was even worse. The weight of it pressed down on her as she turned, walking back toward the galley, her mind spinning. Then, just as she reached the curtain, the in-flight phone rang again. Every muscle in her body locked up. She turned slowly, watching as Daniel picked it up, glancing at her before answering. Yes? A pause. Daniel blinked, his eyebrows furrowing. He nodded once, then hung up. When he turned to face her, his expression was unreadable. "You're not getting off with security anymore." Evelyn's breath hitched. "What?" she asked, staring at him, her pulse pounding in her ears. Daniel hesitated, then gestured toward Marcus. "I mean, he changed his mind." The words barely registered as Evelyn's entire world shifted beneath her. Marcus Hayes had just spared her. Her heart thundered as she turned toward 1A, searching for an answer, but Marcus was already looking at her, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. Her chest felt tight. Why? Why had he given her a way out? Why hadn't he let her crash and burn? She didn't know. But what she did know is that she would never forget this moment for the rest of her life. Just minutes ago, she had been certain her career was over. Security was supposed to escort her off the plane. The captain himself had told her that Marcus, the man she had humiliated, the man she had doubted, the man she had treated like an imposter, had already flagged her for disciplinary review. And now he had changed his mind. Her head was spinning as she stepped back toward the galley, gripping the counter for support. Daniel watched her closely, his voice low. "What just happened?" Evelyn swallowed hard. She had no answer because none of this made sense. She had expected Marcus to let the punishment play out. She deserved it. But instead, he had spared her. And now, the one question hammering in her mind was why. Her breathing was shallow as she peeked through the curtain, watching him. Marcus sat there, still composed, still unfazed, as if nothing had happened at all. He scrolled through his phone, took another sip of water, completely at ease. The first-class passengers had picked up on the shift, and she could see it in the way they looked at him now. Some stole glances, some whispered quietly, others looked embarrassed. They had all sat there and watched her question him. They had seen her doubt him, and not one of them had spoken up. Now, though, they knew exactly who he was, and none of them would forget it. Evelyn's pulse thundered as she turned back into the galley. She couldn't just stand there. She needed to do something. Something right. Moving quickly, she grabbed a fresh towel, a tray, and a glass of sparkling water. She added a lemon wedge, made sure the napkin was folded perfectly. Daniel frowned. "What are you doing?" Evelyn didn't answer. She had already humiliated herself once. She wasn't about to make it worse. Her legs felt heavy as she stepped back into the cabin, balancing the tray carefully. It felt like the longest walk of her life. When she reached 1A, she carefully placed the drink on his tray table. Marcus didn't look up. He let the silence stretch, as if deciding whether or not to acknowledge her. Evelyn cleared her throat, forcing herself to speak. "I know an apology isn't enough, Mr. Hayes, but I was wrong, completely, and I appreciate your patience more than I deserve." Finally, Marcus looked up. He studied her, not with anger, not with irritation, just calm observation. Then, after a long moment, he gave a single nod. A small, quiet acknowledgement. That was it. Evelyn let out a slow breath, realizing this was the closest thing to closure she was going to get. She turned to walk away, but just as she did, Marcus spoke. "Evelyn." She froze. She turned back slowly. He had never used her name before today. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the armrest. "Do you know why I changed my mind?" Her mouth felt dry. She shook her head. "No, sir." Marcus tapped a single finger against the tray table, his gaze steady. "Because accountability means more than punishment." Evelyn felt something shift inside her. Marcus wasn't the kind of man who sought revenge. He wasn't looking to destroy her career. He was looking to teach her a lesson, one that would last longer than any punishment ever could. And she knew she would never forget it. The silence stretched between them before Marcus gave her a final nod, dismissing her. Evelyn turned and walked away, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. This wasn't just about her job anymore. It was about who she would choose to be moving forward. Evelyn had walked these aisles 1,000 times before, but never like this. Never with her heart pounding in her chest, never with her mind racing over the consequences of her own actions. The cabin felt different now. The energy had shifted. She could see it in the way passengers sat, some stealing glances at Marcus, others looking away, embarrassed for having witnessed everything. They had watched her challenge him, had seen her doubt him, and now they knew exactly who he was. She swallowed hard and stepped back into the galley, barely noticing Sophie and Daniel standing there. The moment she entered, Daniel exhaled loudly. Okay. What the hell just happened? Sophie folded her arms tightly across her chest. That's what I'd like to know. Evelyn gripped the counter, trying to steady herself. She was still trying to figure it out herself. Just minutes ago, she had been convinced her career was over. The captain had told her she was done. Security was supposed to be waiting for her at the gate. And yet, Marcus Hayes had changed everything with a single message. Daniel's voice was quieter now. Evelyn, seriously, what did you say to him? She shook her head. It wasn't about what I said. Sophie narrowed her eyes. Then what was it? Evelyn exhaled sharply, looking away. She didn't want to say it out loud. She didn't want to admit that Marcus had done something no one else ever had. He had forced her to confront herself. He had held up a mirror, made her see exactly what kind of person she had been in that moment, and instead of punishing her, he had done something worse. He had made her live with it. She turned back toward the curtain, peeking into the cabin once more. Marcus was still in 1A, still perfectly composed, scrolling through his phone as if he hadn't just completely changed the course of her life. Her stomach twisted. Sophie's voice was softer now. Are you okay? Evelyn let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't funny, but it was the only reaction she had left. Was she okay? No. She had spent her entire career believing she was good at her job, that she knew people, that she could read a situation, and in a single evening, she had been proven dead wrong. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she finally responded. I don't know. Daniel and Sophie exchanged a glance, but neither of them pushed her further. They all knew this wasn't just about one mistake. This was about something much bigger, something that would follow her forever. And whether she liked it or not, she was going to have to live with it. Evelyn had always prided herself on being in control. She knew how to handle passengers, knew how to diffuse difficult situations, knew how to command respect without demanding it. But for the first time in her career, she wasn't in control. She stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her pulse was still racing, her chest tight. Everything that had just happened, the confrontation, the realization, the public humiliation, circled in her mind like a storm she couldn't escape. And Marcus Hayes. He was still sitting there, like he hadn't just altered the course of her life. Daniel let out a low whistle. So, what now? Evelyn didn't answer, because she didn't know. For the first time in a long time, she had no idea what happened next. She had assumed Marcus would let the captain's decisions stand, that he would let her career crash and burn the same way she had almost ruined his experience on this flight. And yet, he didn't. Why? Why had he changed his mind? Why had he spared her? She exhaled shakily, pressing her fingertips against her temple. Because he wanted her to live with it. That realization hit her harder than anything else. If he had let her be escorted off the plane, she would have been humiliated, yes. She would have probably lost her job, probably struggled to find another one in the industry. But eventually, she would have found a way to justify it. She would have convinced herself that Marcus Hayes had been the problem, that he had been arrogant, that he had been unreasonable, that he had set her up to fail. But this was worse. Because now, every time she stepped onto a plane, every time she saw a first-class passenger settle into their seat, every time she questioned someone in the smallest way, she would think about him. She would remember what she had done. She would remember the way he had handled it. And she would know deep down that it had never been about him. It had been about her. Sophie watched her closely, something unreadable in her expression. You okay? Evelyn let out a breath, one that felt heavier than it should have. I don't know. Sophie leaned back against the counter, nodding slowly like she understood. And for the first time all night, Evelyn wasn't sure if she understood herself. Sophie crossed her arms and let out a dry chuckle. Well, if it makes you feel any better, I think everyone in first class feels like crap right now. Evelyn blinked. What? Sophie smirked slightly. Come on, you saw their faces. Every single one of them watched you question him. Every single one of them heard you doubt him, and not one of them said a damn thing. Not one of them told you to back off. She tilted her head toward the curtain, toward the now eerily silent first-class cabin. Now they all know. They sat next to the man who owns this airline, and they let it happen. Evelyn hadn't even thought about that. She had been so focused on her own mistake that she hadn't realized it wasn't just hers. It was theirs too. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. I mean, it's kind of genius when you think about it. Evelyn shot him a sharp look. What? Daniel shrugged. Think about it. He could have just told you who he was immediately, could have pulled rank, embarrassed you, gotten you thrown off the flight right away. He nodded toward 1A, toward Marcus, who still looked completely calm, completely in control, but he didn't. Evelyn's breath caught. Daniel continued, his voice dropping slightly. He let you do it. He let you doubt him, let you assume, let everyone assume, let them all feel comfortable, let them all believe that they were right. He let out a low whistle. And then, he let the truth hit everyone at once. Evelyn's heart skipped. That was exactly what he had done. Marcus had never been powerless in that moment. He had never been a victim. He had been in control the entire time. He had let them reveal their own biases, their own assumptions, their own quiet approval of what was happening. And then, without ever raising his voice, without ever needing to argue, he had flipped the entire plane on its head. Daniel chuckled under his breath. Honestly, I kind of respect it. Evelyn's stomach turned, because now she knew the truth. Marcus Hayes hadn't just taught her a lesson. He had taught the entire plane one. And the worst part? They would all remember it, forever. She turned away from the curtain, her hand still shaking slightly. Sophie watched her carefully. So, what are you going to do? Evelyn swallowed, her mind still spinning. What was she supposed to do? What could she possibly say? What could she possibly do that would change any of this? She had already made her choice. She had already shown Marcus exactly who she was. And now, she had to live with it. Evelyn had always thought of herself as someone who knew right from wrong. She had worked for this airline for years, knew the ins and outs of first-class service better than anyone. She knew when someone was trying to sneak an upgrade, when someone was lying about their status, when someone was pushing their luck. She had been so sure she was right about Marcus Hayes, and yet, she had never been more wrong about anything in her life. She took a deep breath, staring at her reflection in the polished metal of the galley cabinets. The woman looking back at her wasn't the same one who had started this flight. That woman had been confident, certain, unshakable. Now, she wasn't sure of anything. Sophie and Daniel had retreated into their own duties, the tension still thick in the air but slowly settling. Evelyn knew that word would spread. The story of what had happened on this flight, it wouldn't stay confined to these walls. Other flight attendants would hear about it. Pilots would hear about it. Corporate would hear about it. Even if Marcus had decided not to have her thrown off the flight, that didn't mean she was safe. She would still be reviewed, still be questioned, still be held accountable. She swallowed hard and took one last look at herself before stepping out of the galley. The first-class cabin was quieter than usual. Passengers weren't talking as much. The usual hum of polite conversation was gone. She felt their eyes on her as she walked back through the aisle. Some curious, some judgmental, some ashamed. But Marcus Hayes still wasn't looking at her, and she felt like that was intentional. He wasn't the kind of man who wasted time on people who weren't worth it. And right now, that's exactly what she felt like. She reached the service station at the front of the cabin and started checking on the other passengers, forcing herself to go through the motions. A refill here, a small, polite smile there. She tried to pretend nothing had happened, but everyone knew, including her. Then, a deep voice cut through the silence. "Excuse me," Evelyn froze. Slowly, she turned toward 1A. Her pulse thundered. Marcus was looking at her now, his expression still unreadable, still measuring her. For a second, she thought he was going to finally tell her off, but he didn't. Instead, he simply said, "I'd like another water, please." That was it. No lecture, no reminder of what had happened, just a request. Like she was just another flight attendant, like he was just another passenger, like she was still worthy of doing her job. Evelyn blinked, caught off guard by the simple normalcy of it. Then quickly she nodded. "Of course, Mr. Hayes." Her voice was steady now. Not because she had forgotten what had happened, not because she had forgiven herself, but because she finally understood. Marcus Hayes had given her something far worse than punishment. He had given her the chance, the opportunity, to be better. And that was something she couldn't waste. She turned, moving with purpose, grabbing a fresh glass, filling it with cold water, carefully placing a lemon wedge inside just as she had before. But this time, she wasn't just serving a first-class passenger. She was serving the man who had just changed her life forever. She carried the tray back to his seat, placed it down gently in front of him, and stepped back. Marcus met her eyes one final time. And this time, there was something new in his gaze. Not approval, not forgiveness, but recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that she had learned something today, a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. Evelyn stood there for half a second longer before giving a slight nod. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, letting the moment settle into her bones. This flight would land soon. The world would keep moving. But she would never be the same again. For a moment, Evelyn hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Then, quickly she nodded. Of course, Mr. Bot Hayes. Her voice was steady now, not because she had forgotten what had happened, not because she had forgiven herself, but because she finally understood. Marcus had given her something far worse than punishment. He had given her the chance to be better, and that was something she couldn't afford to waste. She turned, moving with purpose. She grabbed a fresh glass, filled it with cold water, carefully placed a lemon wedge inside, just as she had before. But this time she wasn't just serving a first-class passenger. She was serving the man who had just changed her life forever. She carried the tray back to his seat, placed it down gently in front of him, and stepped back. Marcus met her eyes one final time. And this time there was something different in his gaze. Not approval, not forgiveness, but recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that she had learned something today, a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Evelyn stood there for half a second longer before giving a slight nod. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, letting the moment settle deep into her bones. This flight would land soon. The world would keep moving. But she would never be the same again. Did Evelyn get what she deserved? Was this karma or just a lesson learned? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.